Well, I've been to Ethiopia many times, so this is not my first time, and I understand the situation and the politics of Ethiopia very well. I've studied it over the last 10, 12 years. I've been looking at Africa as an analyst for over 30 years. The Western media and the Western governments, Europe and the United States, are carrying out what I would call psychological warfare by creating false stories. They're not just misinforming people, they're disinforming people intentionally. Since I've arrived at Addis, you see the bars are open, hotels are open, my plane was nearly full, the airport's functioning, children and people are out on the streets. Therefore, the media knows this as well as you and I do sitting here, because it's true, it's reality. The U.S. Embassy here knows this. Therefore, when the State Department puts out a warning not to travel, which is I had to disobey the warning, they know it's not true because they can see it for themselves, as we can see sitting here in this hotel. Therefore, it's a conscious campaign. It's political warfare to weaken, demoralize, and weaken the morale of the Ethiopian government to fight to restore the sovereignty of its nation, which is now under attack by the TPLF. Well, you have the basic problem you have in the Western world is that you have a diseased way of thinking called geopolitics, where you have the political economic elite of the world. I call them an oligarchy. They believe they should control everything. And they believe that it's a limited world, and therefore the main purpose in life is to be number one. And that's why you see the attacks on China in particular coming from their work in Africa. This geopolitics is geared towards control. They see Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed as not under their control. And therefore they would rather create chaos and war in the Horn of Africa than not control it for themselves. It's a form of insanity. It's very hard for people to think this way, but I've studied this for 50 years. And the problem is that we have people in the Biden administration who are trying to pull President Biden into this destabilization or potential regime change in Ethiopia. I don't know if he'll go along with it, because I don't know if he wants to have his government be responsible for destabilizing a long-time ally, like the way President Obama destabilized Libya. Now, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, he's trying to lead his country against an ethnic movement. But you can't allow an ethnic separatist group to militarily attempt to overthrow your government and then demand negotiations with your government as equals. The Prime Minister was elected in 2 elections this year, June and September. I calculated over 43 million votes. That's never been recognized by President Biden, by the State Department, or the U.S. Congress, or anyone in Europe for that matter.
Why is that?
Because they don't want to recognize, they don't want to admit that there was a democratic election where the people came out, 43 million out of 110, came out to support a prime minister, because they don't want him to have that kind of political leadership in your country. So they have refused to recognize an election. I was here for the election, the African Union was here, and they said it was a fair election. My government has never said anything positive. Yet, they treat the TPLF, which is trying to overthrow that government, as an equal party to an elected government. If that continues, then all of Africa is in trouble. Because as you know, Africa is filled with ethnic groups. I mean, there's hundreds of them. If the U.S. gives equality to the TPLF, then they're giving a green light for wars and separations across the continent, like the Biafra War in 1967, which almost tore apart Nigeria. Well, I didn't read the report of those institutions, but they were not represented here during the election. There were 6 total Americans here. So they could not have viewed the election, checked the polls, been election observers. The only one who came out was about 65 people, was the African Union. The problem is you have people inside the Biden administration, not necessarily President Biden himself. You have people in the Biden administration who have long-time contacts with the TPLF. And they want to maintain that kind of control over Ethiopia. You have people like Secretary Blinken, who says, oh, we're having a humanitarian disaster in Tigray. Gail Smith, Samantha Power, Linda Thomas Greenfield. But they ignore the fact that there's 7 million IDPs in Afar and Amara. That's far more than there are suffering in Tigray. Now, all the suffering is wrong, but the TPLF is not going to relieve that suffering. It's up to the government. The elected government has to resolve this war by the TPLF conceding that they can't overthrow government, and then we have to get on with the task of rebuilding the country, because the economic growth that the Ethiopians were leading for the last 10 years has been weakened. And if you the solution is increased economic wealth for everybody as one Ethiopia. We can't have ethnic groups forming their own states dictating policy. There's only one citizenship. It's called being a citizen of Ethiopia, not a citizen of a group. You can maintain the groups, but once you have an elected government, you have to respect that government. If you don't like the government, you have to then change the government in the next election. But you can't then declare war and demand to be part of a new transitional government, which also could include the removal of the elected government of Prime Minister Abiy. So if this support by these factions in the US and in Europe, if this is not overturned, if this is legitimized, if the TPLF is legitimized, then what would stop every other ethnic group from launching a confrontation? There's 250 ethnic groups in Nigeria. And they already had a civil war that killed 1 million people because the Igbos rebelled in '67 against the government. So this, you're playing with a powder keg here of confrontation across the whole continent. And it's really, I can say this as an American, the idiocy of my government not recognizing the danger of what they're doing. This is a serious problem. And we have to wake them up, and we have to appeal to the president, Joe Biden, not that he doesn't want to have a war as his legacy. He doesn't want to have the legacy of disrupting and destabilizing Ethiopia as his legacy. And we have to make sure that we succeed in that. So you have to realize something, that their view of democracy is imposing their rule of democracy. The history of the United States, by the way, is we're not a democracy, we're a democratic republic. We supposed to elect the wisest, most intelligent people to elect our president. It's actually called the Electoral College. We're not a pure democracy, as the last elections have shown. But when the Secretary Blinken and others say we want democracy, what they really mean is they want to impose their will on other countries. For me, democracy is not just elections. Real democracy, real genuine democracy, is having a citizenry that's educated and has the time and the material standard of living and the leisure to discuss policies for their country. Democracy really means the citizens having a discussion about the future of the country. What does that mean, though? That means you have to have electricity, you have to have food, you have to have adequate housing so your children can study and read, and you can meet in various town hall meetings and forums and say, well, look, this is where I think Ethiopia should go. This is what I think the best policy is. But you have a debate about the future of your country as common Ethiopian citizens. not as ethnic groups. That, to me, is democracy. But for real democracy, you have to have development. They claim that the fundamental human right is democracy. But for me,